I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep again after what happened that night. I'm writing it more as a rant, because I've tried to tell other people, and no one believes. They say that it is a thing of the head of those who spent years in prison, which was perhaps the fear, the adrenaline of escape, but I know not. That farm, that old man, and everything we saw is impossible to forget. That night, me and the other four, Jack, Sam, George, and Lemuel, escaped from Dorchester Penitentiary. We planned it for months, every detail, every escape route. We wanted to cross the border into the United States, where no one would know who we were. We thought we were prepared for everything, but this we could not predict. We ran all night, crossing what seemed to be an endless thicket, until, already tired and with the sun starting to rise, we saw a farm in the distance. At that moment, the vision of a house was like a rupture. We were exhausted, hungry, and the idea was to find somewhere to rest a little before moving on. The house looked abandoned, with dusty windows, the roof half sunken, and fences falling apart. There had been no sign of anyone living there for a long time. So, we decided to approach cautiously. The first thing I remember, when I got closer, was the strange silence around. It seemed like even the birds dared to make noise there. As we approached the house, we agreed that 3 of us would go through the back door, and the other 2 knocked on the front door to see if there was anyone. If you did, the idea was to tie up the person and take what it takes to survive for a while more, just until we are safe again. I went down with Sam and George, and we waited to see if anyone came out. After a while, Jack appeared at the door saying that the house was empty, and we all went in. The place was filthy, with a musty smell and full of dust. There was a rat running through the corners and cobwebs spread in every corner. It didn't seem like anyone lived there, but I could see that someone had been there recently, with some open food cans and dirt traces on the floor. Soon we started searching the house for food and water. We found some old cans of meat and beans. Sam went out to see if there was a well or some way to get water, because the taps were dry. It wasn't long before we heard him screaming to go to the barn. His voice sounded desperate, and we ran without thinking twice. When I got there, I saw Sam standing with his face pale and his eyes fixed on the bottom of the barn. I followed his look, and in the shadows there was a man, a long, white-haired man standing, watching us with an expression that I can't describe today. He seemed too quiet, as if he was waiting for us. At that time, I felt the air become heavier, as if his presence brought something bad. He said nothing, just looked at us with that fixed look, almost as if he knew what we were thinking. Jack, who was always the most impulsive of the group, began to get angry at the silence of the old man and told him to tie it up. The idea was to make sure he didn't report us, but there was something about that man that made everyone uncomfortable. He did not try to fight nor complain. He stood still, staring at each of us as we strapped him in a chair with an old rope that we found there in the barn. Even tied up, he kept looking with that same calm look, and I started to feel a strange shiver in the back of my head, as if there was something very wrong with him. After we tied the old man, we went back inside to eat what we had found and rest a little. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something in that look, in that calm, that made me suspicious, a sense of danger that I could not explain. When we were eating, Sam came back from outside and said he had found a well with water, but when he saw the old man tied up, he was upset. Jack laughed, saying that the old man was just trying to scare us with that sinister look, but I could not get out of his head what he told us before being tied: go away before nightfall. Time passed, and despite the tension I felt, we ended up falling asleep because we were so tired. When I woke up, the daylight was already going away. The silence inside the house was strange, as if something had changed, but I did not know what. I decided to go to the barn to take a look at the old man, to see if he was still there. When I went in, I didn't hear any sound, and I started feeling a little dizzy, as if the air inside was heavier than normal. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that the chair was empty. The rope, which should be holding the old man, was on the ground, torn. I called the others desperate, and in seconds they arrived, looking with the same expression of dread as me. No one could understand how he had escaped. The rope was tight, and the old man didn't seem to have the strength to break it. We tried to think of any logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the bottom of the barn, a low sound, almost like a growl, that froze everyone's blood. It was enough for us to decide to get out of there as soon as possible. But when we ran towards the barn doors, we found that they were locked from the outside. Something or someone had put a chain with a lock, and we were stuck in there with whatever it was that was making those sounds. Despair began to take hold, and each reacted in a different way. Sam started screaming to see if anyone out there could hear, but the farm was so isolated it was impossible. The only thing I could think of was to find another way out. Then we all started looking for some weak spot in the barn walls, any crack that we could use to escape. Jack, who was already more angry than usual, decided to take a piece of wood to try to break down one of the doors. But before he did anything, we heard another noise, this time closer, as if the steps were coming from the bottom. At that moment, we realized that he was being watched. We felt the weight of a look, even without seeing anything directly. It was when Lemuel, who was further away, let out a suffocated cry and fell to the ground, pulling his hands to the neck as if something invisible was holding him. We ran to him, but it was too late. The look of panic on his face was enough for me to understand that something was happening there, something that was not normal. The feeling of impotence, of not being able to do anything to help, was suffocating. We dumped the body of Lemuel right there, knowing that any second more in that barn could be our end too. With a heart pounding and a fear I had never felt before, I began frantically looking for anything that could be a way out. The sounds around us became more intense, as if something was approaching slowly, almost like a hunt that we enjoyed with the prey before. The final attack. That's when George disappeared. 1 second he was there, on our side, and the other, nothing. All we heard was a brief, desperate cry from the darkness. No one could process what was happening. There was no more logic, there was no more control, only total despair. It was at that moment I realized that there was no way to get out of there in one piece. Jack was beside me, wounded and pale, and we only thought about surviving at any cost. Out of nowhere, I heard my own voice whispering to myself, saying that I had to get out of there, no matter what. I caught Jack, almost carrying him, and looked for a way out with all the strength that was left. It was then that I saw a minimal opening in one of the barn boards, a point where the wood was loose. With all my strength, I started pushing and hitting until she finally gave in, opening a hole that led to the outside. As soon as the hole opened, I didn't think twice. I pushed Jack first, almost throwing him out. I didn't know what was on the other side, but anything was better than staying there. Jumped soon after, and we started running without looking back, stumbling in the dark with hearts almost exploding in our chest. We could not see anything but the shadows of the trees, but still, we kept running as if something was right behind us. At one point, I felt that a presence was following us, something I could not see, but it was there watching me, chasing us. We ran until we saw a road, and there, for a second, we felt an absurd relief. We stopped to catch our breath, and it was only then that I realized that Jack was badly injured. He could barely move, and his arm was bleeding a lot. At that moment, I felt that maybe they would not get out of this situation alive, that something much bigger than us was involved. With the little strength he still had, Jack looked at me, and without saying anything, I knew that he felt the same thing. We had witnessed something that was not of this world, something that would never be explained. After some time walking along the road, not knowing where we were, we finally found help. A car passed and stopped to help Jack, who was almost fainting. The people who helped us called the police, and while we waited, all I could think of was the old man, that farm and what we had left behind. When we tried to tell what happened, no one took it seriously. The cops found a way to arrest us again, but I knew that even if I was arrested, I would never be at peace. What I saw on that farm would haunt me forever. Days later, we learned that the police came back to investigate the place, but they only found remains of what seemed to be a crime scene, something terrible, but nothing that could explain what we lived in. The old man, as I was told, was there intact, and when asked about us, he just laughed. Until today, no one has been able to understand what really happened. Jack lost his arm, and I lost sleep, because sometimes I still feel like I'm on that farm, stuck in that barn, with no way out. And no matter how long it takes, I could never explain to anyone what really happened that night. I was never a person to scare easily, but what I went through that night on the Appalachian Trail changed it forever. The idea was an adventure between friends, a walk through nature to disconnect a little, and maybe take some nice pictures. Me, Mark, Sarah, and Olivia started early, crossing a stretch that is said to be little explored, precisely because we wanted to avoid those more popular spots, full of people. Everything was quiet, the day went by without problems, and we were even thinking about stretching the trail a little more. By that time we started to see signs of an abandoned hut, which made us curious. She looked old and worn, but with the fatigue already beating, we decided that there was a good place to set up camp. When night fell, the weather changed in a way that is difficult to explain. The silence got weird, as if something was spying on us from afar, you know? I think nobody wanted to say anything not to sound paranoid, but you could see that everyone was more tense. It was then that we started to hear some strange noises like steps, but kind of dragged, coming from somewhere between the trees. Tim tried to calm us down, saying it could be an animal, maybe a deer, but I don't know. There was something in that sound that didn't seem normal. The feeling was that something was surrounding us, coming closer and closer, and I had no idea how to react. When the noises got louder, we decided to investigate, even if no one had the courage for it. We took the lanterns and started walking around the camp, trying to see if we could find any clue of what was making that sound. The hut was only a few meters from where we set up the tents, so it was natural to start there. When we got close, we saw marks on the ground, footprints that looked fresh but were clumsy, as if someone had been dragging their feet. That has already made everyone more nervous. It seemed that, since we arrived, there was something or someone watching us closely, and just thinking about it my stomach would not. We decided that it was best to go back to camp and wait for things to calm down, but no one could relax. It seemed that the air itself had become heavier, and Tim, who was always the most rational, was getting impatient, as if he was suspicious of us. He started to question whether someone was trying to play a trick, which I knew was ridiculous, but it was as if he was convincing himself of it. I tried to calm the mood, saying that it was best for everyone to concentrate and stay together, but I could see that the mood had changed. We were tense, tired, and beginning to distrust each other. As we tried to keep together, another noise echoed, louder and closer, and this time it seemed to come from several sides at the same time. The worst was to realize that it was too dark around, as if the lanterns did not light up beyond a few meters. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched became much stronger, as if eyes were surrounding us in the darkness. Olivia started getting really scared, and said she felt something was moving between the trees. I wanted to say that she was exaggerating, but I myself had begun to see shadows moving, fast and silent, as if they were studying us. That's when, without warning, Tim broke away from the group. He shouted that he was going to check a part of the trail alone, ignoring our requests for him to come back. No one had the courage to go after him, and all we could hear were his steps disappearing into the dark. Sarah started crying, saying we should leave before something worse happens. I was paralyzed, trying to understand if it was real or just a collective paranoia. But the fact is that with Tim gone and Olivia and Sarah getting more scared, it became clear that something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. After Tim disappeared into the darkness, it was just me, Sarah, and Olivia, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Sarah was panicking, and Olivia seemed to be trying to keep her cool, but I could see in her eyes that she was as terrified as we were. We tried to stay together and talk as little as possible, because any noise seemed to echo and made us even more nervous. It was then that we heard another noise, a more strange and low sound, as if someone was scratching wood, and it seemed to come from inside the cabin. That was too much. Just thinking about going back there, I felt my body freezing, but at the same time it seemed that I could not escape. We were surrounded. Olivia started to walk towards the sound, and Sarah and I followed her, because no one wanted to be alone. As we entered the hut, the silence was absolute, as if the sound had ceased as soon as we crossed the door. We lit the space with lanterns, but saw nothing but old furniture and accumulated dust. As we were about to leave, I heard a soft sound behind me, like a breath. I came quickly, but there was no one. The fear was beginning to border on despair, and as much as we tried to keep calm, I felt that something really inexplicable was happening with us that night. The tension reached an unbearable point, and we decided to return to camp, hoping that Tim had returned. But when we arrived, we realized that he was not there, and our tents were turned over, as if someone had searched everything. Sarah collapsed for good, crying and saying that we had to get out of there immediately. I wanted to leave too, but something inside me told me that leaving Tim behind could be even worse. But then, when we were trying to decide what to do, we heard heavy steps coming from the track direction. My heart popped, and I held my breath, hoping it was Tim, but the silence that came soon after was even more frightening. Suddenly, Olivia turned and started walking alone towards the trees. I yelled at her to come back, but it seemed she was in a trance, as if she wasn't listening to anything. Sarah and I ran after her, trying to hold her, but she ignored us completely. When we finally managed to hold her, she looked at us with an empty expression, as if she did not know who we were. That look froze me to the soul. It was at that moment that I realized that something was happening with each of us, slowly and quietly, stirring our minds and the way we saw each other. Sarah and I were in shock, trying to understand what had just happened to Olivia. We tried to make her return to the camp, but it seemed that she was in another world, staring at nothing and babbling things I could not understand. I began to feel completely helpless, as if there was nothing I could do to save any of us. The worst thing is that, at this point, I didn't even know if we should try to wait for Tim or run away from there. But then, in the middle of that chaos, we heard another sound, this time a distant whisper, almost as if it was the voice of Tim calling us. The voice came from inside the forest, and Sarah held my arm, desperate, saying that it couldn't be Tim. But I, perhaps out of desperation, decided that I had to follow the sound. We needed to make sure he was okay, but as we walked toward the call, everything became darker, as if shadows were enveloping us. Sarah stopped in the middle of the road, saying she would not take a step even, but I forced myself to continue. However, as I got closer to the sound, I realized that the call stopped, and the silence was so intense that I could hear my own accelerated breathing. It was at that moment I realized I was completely alone. Sarah and Olivia had been left behind, and Tim was still missing. The silence around me was so heavy that I began to feel suffocated, as if something invisible were squeezing my chest. The dark seemed denser, and the feeling of being observed was unbearable. I started to come back, but with each step it seemed that I was walking in circles, unable to find the way back. I saw nothing but shadows, and as much as I called for Sarah or Olivia, the only sound I heard was the echo of my own voice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I managed to get back to the camp, but when I arrived, the place was empty. The tents were still there, but no sign of anyone. I approached one of the tents and saw footprints around, as if someone had walked around repeatedly. The feeling of being completely alone left me paralyzed, and for a moment I felt like I was about to collapse. All I wanted was to get out of there, but the fear of leaving my friends behind prevented me from taking the next step. Not knowing what else to do, I decided that the only option was to wait until dawn. I sat by the faded fire, trying to hear any sound that would indicate they were nearby, but the night seemed more and more endless. My body was exhausted, but fear kept me awake. Every little sound, the rustling of leaves, the cracking of branches in the distance, made my heart go up because I didn't know if it was an animal, one of my friends coming back, or something worse. Time seemed frozen, and I counted the seconds, hoping that daylight would bring some sense of security, but that security never came. When the sun began to appear, the clarity of the day brought a strange calm, but the camp remained empty. It was only then that I realized the reality. Sarah and Olivia had disappeared, as well as Tim. I looked around once more, trying to find any sign of them, but it was as if they had evaporated, leaving no trace. The only thing left were those messy footprints around the tents. The silence, now without the weight of darkness, gave me a last feeling of emptiness. I had come with 3 friends, and now I was alone, not understanding what happened that night, nor why I was the only one to leave. When I took the job of cleaning that old warehouse outside of Detroit, I didn't think I would end up experiencing something I could never explain. The company that hired us said it would be simple. Go in, take out everything that was still inside, and free up space for demolition. It turns out that it was an old, forgotten, and dusty place. The walls were peeling, and the smell was strong, as if no one had been there for decades. We were 3 that night, me, Nate, and Carlos. We decided to do the work during the morning because, besides being more calm, it seemed that the whole city was dead at this time, which made the service even faster. The night went by without any problems until, in a corner of the basement, we found a heavy metal door, almost hidden behind some old boxes. Nate, curious as always, decided to see what he had back there. He thought it was a maintenance room or something, but as soon as he opened up, the smell was the first thing that scared us. It was a strange smell, something between mold and a heavy metallic odor. We lit our lanterns and went down some steps that led to a kind of underground room. It was as if that space was hidden all the time, as if no one knew it existed. When we went down, the first thing we saw were several boxes spread out, some open, others stacked in a way that seemed kind of random. But what really caught our attention was the content. Clothes, old photos, personal items. Things that no one would leave in a place like this by choice. Carlos took one of these photos and saw that it was a girl, with a name scribbled behind. It was disturbing to think that these objects belonged to someone, and we all began to feel uncomfortable, as if we were invading something very personal, or even forbidden. The more we fiddled with the boxes, the stranger it all seemed. It was like we were fiddling with a collection of interrupted lives. That's when Nate started acting weird. He was quieter than usual, and suddenly he was fixed in one of the boxes, stirring and rumbling, as if looking for something specific. I asked what he was doing, but he didn't answer. He just looked at me with a distant, almost empty look. I started to get worried, and Carlos also realized that something was wrong. We even suggested that we should leave there and continue the work in the morning, but Nate simply ignored it. He kept moving the boxes, more and more obsessed, while Carlos and I became more and more apprehensive about what we were seeing and feeling in that place. That situation began to become unsustainable. Carlos and I tried to pull Nate back, but he seemed completely hypnotized by those objects, as if he was stuck in a kind of trance. He took an old watch that he found in one of the boxes and kept turning his fingers, looking at it with a sick fascination. Every second down there increased the feeling that we should not be in that place. I looked around and began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Marks on the walls, as if someone had scratched the surface with nails or some sharp object, plus a strange layer of dust that seemed fresh, as if someone had been there recently. When I suggested again to us to leave, I realized that the radio was not working. I thought it was a signal problem because we are underground, but the feeling of isolation began to weigh more. It was then that we heard a sound of footsteps, very light, but echoed through the basement, as if someone else was there with us. Carlos and I exchanged a look of dread, and Nate, he seemed to have heard nothing, totally disconnected from what was happening. This sound of steps kept on, getting closer and closer, but never reached us. It was as if something was around, watching us, but never showing up. By this time, my heart was racing, and I could only think of getting out of there as soon as possible. But Nate was completely out of his mind. He began to whisper things I could not understand right, words disconnected, and his gaze was fixed on an empty wall, as if seeing something we did not see. I tried to shake him, make him return to normal, but he did not react, only murmured lower and lower, almost like a prayer or something. Carlos, who is usually the most calm, was visibly scared. He began to search the place, looking for an alternative exit, but it seemed that we were increasingly trapped, as if the air itself in that basement was more dense and oppressive. It was then that, in the middle of this madness, we heard a metallic noise, as if something heavy had fallen outside the room where we were. The steps stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. We tried to contact someone on the radio again, but all we heard was static. Carlos and I tried to open the door to get out, but she didn't move an inch, as if it had been locked from the outside. I began to feel a despair that I had never felt before. Everything around seemed to be squeezing, pushing us into some sort of invisible trap, and Nate, he was still there, lost in thoughts and whispers, completely oblivious to our growing panic. Time began to pass in a strange way inside. Each second seemed to last an eternity, and the feeling of claustrophobia only worsened. Carlos started to knock on the door with everything, trying to break it in, but it was useless. It seemed that she was locked with something very heavy on the other side. Meanwhile, Nate was still in that sort of trance, and suddenly he started laughing softly, a muffled and scary laugh. I stepped away, trying to understand what was happening with him, but he didn't seem like the same Nate we knew. He held an old doll that he had found in one of the boxes, staring at it as if he was enchanted. It only increased my despair, because it was clear that something in that room was stirring his head. It was then that the sound of the steps returned, this time louder, as if someone or something was approaching slowly. My body froze, and I could not even look at the door. Carlos was pale, his face wet with sweat, and we both tried to keep quiet, hoping it was just our imagination. But the steps continued closer and closer until they stopped right at the entrance. The silence that followed was so dense that I could hear my own breath, and it was at this moment that I realized something very wrong was happening. Suddenly, we heard the handle move, and that small, almost insignificant sound was enough to make my heart almost stop. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for the worst. But instead of opening, the handle stopped turning, and silence took over again. Nate, however, seemed oblivious to all this. He stood up slowly, still holding the doll, and began to walk towards the door, as if being attracted by something that only he could see. Carlos and I tried to hold him, but he was strong, with a strange determination, as if in trance. I had never seen anything like it before, and it only added to the panic we felt. When Nate leaned on the door, we heard a clapping sound, as if a lock had been unlocked. The door opened slowly, and the hall ahead was plunged into a darkness that seemed even denser than the room we were in. Carlos pulled my arm, trying to push me away, but Nate was already walking down the hall, without even looking back. He disappeared into the darkness, and as much as my instinct made me run, something was holding me there, as if I knew that leaving that place would not be so easy. Carlos and I stood by, looking at the darkness where Nate had disappeared, trying to decide what to do. Every second there was torture, but running away without him seemed like betrayal. Taking a deep breath, I decided to take some steps forward to see if I could see any sign of him in the corridor, but the silence was absolute. We could not see anything, and the darkness seemed to swallow us more and more. The only thing we heard was each other's heavy breathing, mixed with the sound of drops dripping from the ceiling. As we were about to turn around and try to find another way out, we heard Nate's voice, but it sounded distant, almost a whisper. He spoke words that were not related, something about memories and never leave. It was then that Carlos, in complete despair, grabbed my arm and said he could not give more. We decided that the only thing we could do was try to get out of there and get help. It no longer made sense to risk our own lives trying to understand what was happening with him. But as we ran back to the room, I began to feel a huge weight that it might be too late for either of us. When we returned to the room from where we had left, the place looked different, as if it was darker and smaller. It was strange, as if the walls were closing around us. The air was heavy and increasingly difficult to breathe. We tried the exit door once more, slamming it with all our strength, but it was still locked, motionless. Carlos started screaming, calling for help, even though he knew that probably no one would hear us. The echo of his cries only added to the frightening silence that took over everything around us. I felt that we were completely isolated, as if the world outside did not exist anymore. It was then that suddenly the lights began to flash, briefly illuminating the environment with a faint and disturbing brightness. In those blinks, I could see that the room was full of shadows that made no sense. They looked like human figures, but did not move. It was as if they were paralyzed, just watching us. With every blink, I felt a different shiver, as if something within those shadows was waiting for the right moment to move. I looked at Carlos, and he had the same look of panic, a despair that we could not hide anymore. With each flicker of the lights, those shadows seemed closer, as if they were surrounding us slowly, without haste. My heart beat so fast that I thought I would pass out right there. I looked back, trying to see if there was still some space or gap to escape, but everything around seemed more and more closed and oppressive. Carlos was paralyzed, and I could only think of getting out of there anyway, but my feet did not obey. The shadows began to take on more definite forms, and for a fraction of a second I found faces there, faces that seemed desperate, trapped like us, and looking at me with a warning expression, as if they were trying to warn us about something. Then the radio gave a brief signal, a low whine, and I tried to tune in with some frequency, anything that could connect us to the world outside. But before I could understand what was happening, a voice whispered on the radio, almost imperceptible, saying something like, "They never leave." That was the last straw. Carlos and I looked at each other, and in that second, without saying anything, we understood that we were dealing with something beyond what any of us could explain. We tried desperately to push the door once more, and out of nowhere it opened. Without looking back, we ran out of the warehouse, not caring about anything else, only with the need to escape from that damned place. When we finally got out, the cold morning air was like a shock, bringing a relief that I did not know I needed. We were panting, sweating, and with a heart beating, but alive. I looked at Carlos and saw that he was as shaken as me, with the lost look, as if he still did not believe we had escaped. We stood there, standing outside, trying to catch our breath and understand what had just happened. There was no sign of Nate anywhere, and as much as my instinct would go in to look for him, I knew it was impossible. Something in that warehouse was beyond explanation, and going back there would be like signing our own sentence. We tried to explain to the superiors what had happened, but no one took it seriously. They said that Nate had probably left, that it was all just a coincidence and a strange night in an old place. But me and Carlos know what we saw. It was not something normal, and to this day, I wonder what really happened with Nate and all those people whose belongings were in that basement. Never went back there, but sometimes in my nightmares I still hear those steps and see those shadows, as if that warehouse was waiting for someone else to come in and never leave. Never thought that a weekend in a secluded place could change my life so much. The idea of visiting the cottage that I inherited from my grandfather seemed interesting, almost a nostalgic adventure. I invited Jason, my best friend from childhood, to come with me. We knew each other since always, and he was as curious as I about what we found there. But as soon as we arrived at the nearest village, people looked at us in a strange way, as if they knew something that we did not know. Some even commented that the place brought bad memories to those who tried to stay there. Me and Jason laughed, thinking it was just superstition from the country people. But when we arrived at the chalet, a strange feeling took hold of me. It was an old building, dark wood, with windows covered by a thick layer of dust. The place seemed not to see a living soul for years. While we were packing, we realized that the inside was full of junk and boxes were closed. Jason suggested that we open some to see if we could find something interesting about my grandfather's past. And that's exactly what we did. At first, we found old objects such as watches, black and white photos, even documents with strange annotations. Only the more we moved in those things, the more I felt that there was something wrong. As we searched the boxes, we found an old photo album, full of faded images of people I had never seen before. Some photos had notes behind, but the letter was illegible, as if my grandfather had written in a hurry or nervousness. Jason joked that we might be digging up some family secret, but to be honest, that idea didn't make me feel comfortable at all. There was something in the way those pictures were hidden, as if no one should see. It was then that we found a yellow letter with a strange content. It said something about protect the legacy and preserve the silence. It was signed by someone I've never heard of, and the tone seemed more like an order than a memory. Later, when the sun started to set, the mood in the cottage became even heavier. Jason commented that he thought he heard footsteps outside, but when we looked out the window there was nothing but the closed forest and silence. He suggested that we should forget what we read and focus on relaxing. We tried to distract ourselves, but the environment seemed to have a dense energy, as if the chalet itself kept something that we should not discover. By late at night, we started to hear a noise coming from upstairs. Jason said he was going up to see what it was, and I stood down there waiting, trying to convince myself that everything was nothing but paranoia for being in an old and unknown place. I waited for a few minutes, but the silence upstairs was making me more and more nervous. I called Jason a few times, but he didn't answer. At first, I thought he might be playing with me, trying to scare me, so I decided to climb up. The second-floor corridor was even darker than the rest of the house, with a dim light that barely illuminated the space. As I walked through the rooms, I started to notice a strange smell, something mixed between mold and iron, as if the air had been standing there for decades. I reached the last door, which was half open, and the feeling that something horrible was about to happen paralyzed me for a second. I opened the door slowly, calling out Jason's name again, but all I saw was an empty room with old furniture covered in dust and an open window. The wind made the curtain swing, and that's when I realized that Jason had just disappeared. I felt the panic starting to rise, because it did not make sense. I had seen him climb, and had no way of leaving without me noticing. I checked every room, called for him in the whole house, even outside, but there was no sign. The chalet was completely empty, and the feeling of being watched was so strong that I began to feel suffocated. I came down the stairs almost tripping, with my heart pounding. The idea of being alone there, without understanding what had happened to Jason, was too scary. I tried to calm down and think of a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. He just disappeared. I went back to the room where the boxes were, thinking that maybe he had gone out on purpose to play a trick on me, and that at any moment he would appear laughing in my face. But turning things around, I found a small notebook with a worn cover, which I had not seen before. I opened the front page, and saw that it was my grandfather's diary. The contents of the first pages were normal, with daily records, until the notes began to become more and more strange. In the last pages, he spoke about presence in the house and mentioned hearing voices calling him, especially at night. He wrote about people coming and going, and that he needed to keep a secret to protect the blood. I didn't understand what that meant, but the way he wrote showed a growing fear. With each page, it seemed he was getting more paranoid, almost obsessed with something. That made me scared. It was as if he had gone through something that drove him crazy, and now, somehow, I was experiencing the same thing. I felt a chill in my spine as I read those last pages, as if every word pulled me deeper into a nightmare from which I could not escape. My grandfather talked about don't trust whispers, and that they always take one, but he never specified who they were. He only repeated disconnected phrases such as preserve the silence and do not look into their eyes. In the middle of that panic, I started to hear again a noise coming from above, as if someone was walking slowly up the floor. My heart almost stopped. I knew Jason had gone up and disappeared there, and now the sound was back, as if it was trying to call me too. I thought about running away, but something stuck me there, as if I needed to understand what was happening. Climbed the stairs slowly, with each step creaking under my feet, while the sound of steps became more and more clear. I got to the hallway and approached the room where Jason had disappeared. The door was open again, but the room was completely empty, no sign of him. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped, and silence took over. The only thing that remained was the echo of my own breath, and an overwhelming feeling that if I did not get out of there, I might never be able to leave. I didn't think twice. I went down the stairs as fast as I could, almost falling in the process, and went straight to the front door. My hands trembled so much that I could hardly turn the handle. When I finally opened the door and left, I felt an immediate relief, as if I was escaping from an invisible prison. Outside, the fresh air seemed to bring me back to reality, but the dread was still with me. I looked at the cottage one last time, and that's when I noticed a shadow in the window of the room where Jason disappeared. It looked like someone or something was watching me. For a second I thought about going back in and seeing what it was, but the survival instinct spoke louder. I couldn't go back there. I ran off the dirt road to the nearest village, where I got help. I tried to explain what happened, but no one seemed to believe or understand what I had been through. They said I must be imagining things, but I know what I saw. Jason was never found, and to this day no one knows what happened to him. Whenever I think of that cottage, a part of me feels like it's there, trapped in some way. I never understood what happened, but I know that place holds secrets that should be buried forever. When the chance to investigate that abandoned psychiatric hospital came up, I knew at once that I could not let it go. It was closed since the 70s, and there were a series of disappearances that, somehow, were connected to it. It was the kind of story that could bring us both answers and a good story. I was able to convince my friends and coworkers, Claire and Ben, to get on board. After weeks trying permission, we got access to the building through a contact at the city hall, which gave us a temporary pass to explore the place during the night. Everything seemed like a great adventure at first, but I was far from imagining what would happen. We entered the building at dusk, and the place was exactly as one would expect from an abandoned hospital. Dark corridors, peeling walls, and a smell of mold and dust that seemed impregnated even in the bones. The first floor had nothing very interesting but some rusty stretchers and waiting rooms completely destroyed by time. But it was going down to the lower floors that things started to get more intense. We found old files, patient records with incomplete notes and unresolved stories. That already gave an idea of the kind of unethical practice that should be going on there. And with each new document, we felt that we were stumbling upon something no one should have discovered. As we walked through the corridors, the atmosphere became more and more heavy. Claire was the first to comment that she felt like we were being watched. At first, I thought it was just nervousness, something normal when you explore a place like that. But I confess I started feeling the same. It was a strange feeling, as if every step we took awakened something that had been long asleep. Ben, on the other hand, seemed totally focused. He would walk away from us at all times, stopping to take pictures and document everything accurately. He said that the further down we went, the more interesting things appeared, but I was already beginning to doubt whether we should continue. The situation got worse when we found a locked room. Ben, curious as always, tried to force the door until it gave way with a bang. Upon entering, the air became even heavier, almost unbreathable. On the floor, there was a pile of personal objects, such as wallets, family photos, diaries, things that clearly belonged to real people. People who apparently never left. Claire looked at me with a look I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and disgust. And at that moment, for the first time that night, I wondered if we should really be there. As we turned the objects around, a horrible feeling took hold of me, as if I was invading something very particular, something that no one should touch. There was a strange order in that pile of items, as if they were memories left there on purpose. Each photo, each diary, seemed to belong to people who had gone through unimaginable suffering. It was then that Ben began to murmur, almost as if he were talking to himself, saying he was seeing someone. Me and Claire exchanged looks, thinking he was kidding, but his face was serious, pale as hell. He pointed to the end of the corridor, where he allegedly saw a figure moving in the shadows. Claire called his name, trying to bring him back into focus, but Ben ignored it and walked out the hall as if he was following something. I ran after him, but with each step he seemed more distant. It was as if the corridor was stretching away from me. I yelled at him to come back, but he only murmured things unconnected, and suddenly the silence fell. He had disappeared. I looked at Claire, and panic was stamped on her face. We both stood there, not knowing what to do. We looked at each other, trying to understand what was happening, but the truth is that neither of us knew what to do. Standing there seemed more and more insane, but leaving Ben lost in that place was something we couldn't accept. With flashlights trembling in our hands, we decided to explore the corridor where he disappeared, calling his name every few steps. But instead of answers, we only heard our own echoes, resonating through the cold and dirty walls of the hospital. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, That feeling of being watched became more intense, and each shadow seemed to hide something. Claire, normally firm, was visibly shaken. She whispered that something was wrong with the time in there, that the minutes seemed to pass strangely. And I had to agree, because it was like we were in a distorted reality where nothing made sense. We tried to go back to the last place where we saw Ben, but it was like the corridor changed every time we looked at him. The doors seemed to change places, and the silence was so absolute that it hurt. The tension was so great that I felt my heart almost explode in my chest. Every time we turned a corner or tried to open a door, the environment seemed more suffocating, as if the hospital was surrounding us, keeping us in there. We began to hear strange noises, distant steps that echoed through the corridors, but never really approached. It was as if something was playing with us, watching us, but never showing itself. Claire held my arm, her face was white with fear, and I knew she felt the same as me. We were in danger, but we had nowhere to run. When we finally found a staircase that led to the upper floor, we decided to go up, thinking that somehow being closer to the exit would bring us some relief. But when we reached the top, we saw that everything was darker and colder. The windows were covered with dirt, blocking any trace of light from outside. I started to feel a pressure in my head, a fine pain, as if something was trying to get into my mind. Claire began to murmur that she felt the same, and I realized we were being affected by something in that place. It was then that we heard, very lightly, the voice of Ben calling our names. But the voice seemed wrong, almost distorted, as if it came from somewhere far away. Claire and I exchanged a look, and I could see that she was just as confused as me. We shouted his name back, but there was no answer, only that oppressive silence again. At that point, I was already convinced we should leave there, but Claire insisted that we couldn't leave Ben behind. With a tight heart, I agreed to keep looking, even with every fiber of my body saying we should run as fast as possible. We kept walking, and Ben's voice seemed to come from all directions, calling us deeper into the hospital. The more we tried to find it, but the place seemed to involve us like an endless maze. That's when we found a last room, with the door ajar, from where his voice seemed to echo. The dim light of the lanterns illuminated walls full of scratches, and something that looked like old, almost black spots. But there was no sign of Ben, only that horrible feeling that something was wrong. Claire, desperate, went into the room calling for Ben, while I stood at the door, hesitant. I felt a shiver running through my body, as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. She kept calling his name, but the only answer was the muffled echo of her own voice. I looked around and began to notice details that would make anyone shiver. There were hand marks on the walls, as if someone had tried to get out of there without success. Suddenly, the door behind me closed tightly, and the noise echoed through the hallways as a warning. Claire and I tried to open the door, but it seemed locked by some strange mechanism. We started knocking, calling for help, but all we heard was a crushing silence. Then, in the midst of despair, Claire looked at me and said, almost in a whisper, that she felt like the hospital wanted to keep us inside. I knew exactly what she meant, because I felt the same. We were stuck, and the feeling that something was watching us was more intense. After several minutes trying to open the door without success, we began to feel that we would not get out of there. The air was increasingly dense, as if we were breathing dust and heavy memories of something dark. We tried not to panic, but the fear was visible in Claire's eyes. Suddenly, that same sound of footsteps returned, echoing through the corridors. But this time it seemed closer, almost to the side of the door. We stood still, holding our breath, while the steps stopped right in front of the room where we were trapped. It was at this moment that Ben's voice sounded again, but it was strangely calm, too low to be normal. He said that it was all right, and we should let go. It didn't make any sense, and for a second I thought I might be hallucinating. I looked at Claire, and her look of despair only increased my dread. Suddenly, the door unlocked by itself, opening slowly with a creak, as if inviting us to leave. Without thinking twice, I pulled Claire, and we both ran as fast as we could towards the exit, without looking back. We ran through the halls without stopping, with our hearts beating fast, ignoring anything that might be around us. I didn't have the courage to look back, and the silence in the hospital was so oppressive that we could almost hear our own heartbeats. When we finally saw the exit, I felt an immense relief, but also a restlessness, as if the place was still trying to pull us back. As she left, Claire stopped, turned and stared at the building for a few seconds, as if trying to understand what had happened inside. Even after we were safe, she and I could not find an explanation for what we saw or heard. Ben was never found, and no one completely believed our story. To this day, I can't get the feeling out of my head that he is there, stuck in that hospital somehow, as if the place itself had absorbed him. And the scariest is that sometimes in my nightmares, I still hear his voice, distorted and calm, whispering it's okay. Only that I know that, deep down, nothing about that place was really good. When I lost my job and had no place to live, it seemed like my life was at its lowest point. I was wandering aimlessly through a small town in Texas, kind of disoriented, not knowing where to go, when this elderly couple approached and offered me help. They said that they had a small farm nearby, and that I could stay there in exchange for helping with some services. At the time, it was as if a miracle had happened. You called Hank were nice, and his wife Martha looked like one of those movie grandmothers, with a calm expression and a careful way of speaking. It seemed the perfect place for me to get my life together and start over. The first week was quiet. They gave me a room upstairs, very simple but cozy. During the day, I helped with farm tasks, fed the animals, took care of the plantation, fixed fences. But I began to notice that they had a kind of strange concern. They always asked me not to leave the room at night. Hank insisted on it, saying that it was for my own good, that at night weird things could happen there, especially near the barn. At first, I thought it was just the way of old people trying to protect someone, but soon I began to realize that there was something strange in those nights, as if the air itself carried an invisible tension. The nights began to make me restless. I woke up to strange sounds coming from the barn, like straggling footsteps, pops and a low murmur, almost as if someone was whispering. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just paranoia for being in a new place, but every time I heard those sounds, a chill came up through my spine. I asked Hank what was going on there at night, but he just looked away, saying that I shouldn't worry about the barn noises and that it was better to stay inside. Martha also reinforced that, and her look seemed to have some kind of urgency, as if she was really trying to warn me about something I couldn't understand. But the curiosity was growing, and I could not ignore it anymore. I began to notice other details that had not caught my attention before. In the barn, for example, there was a door always locked with a huge padlock. When I asked them what they kept there, Martha answered me too fast, saying it was just old tools and other things of no importance. But the way she spoke made me suspicious. It seemed more that she was trying to hide something. And that's when I started to wonder if that place was really as safe as I thought it would be. My mistrust only increases when I found something that seemed to make no sense. I was sweeping the tool shed, which was next to the barn, when, among some stacked wooden boards, I saw an old backpack. It was dirty and worn, and when I opened it, I found men's clothes, a wallet with documents of someone named Charlie, and even a diary with some notes. The last pages of the diary were scribbled with confusing phrases, things like, "Don't go out at night," and "The barn is not safe." That shocked me. Who was that Charlie, and why were his things there? Even stranger, why did he leave the diary as if trying to warn someone? That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the sounds coming from the barn again. This time, they were louder and more rhythmic, as if someone was beating the wood. I couldn't ignore it, and as much as I felt terrified, I decided that I needed to see what was happening. I waited for the house to be completely silent, dressed, and went down the stairs carefully not to wake Hank and Martha. Fear took hold of me at every step, but curiosity and mistrust were even greater. When I got outside, the air seemed colder than usual, and everything was wrapped in a heavy silence. I walked towards the barn, with my heart beating fast, and at each step I felt a mixture of anxiety and growing fear. I stood in front of that locked door. The sounds had ceased, and all I could hear was my own breath. With a little hesitation, I started looking around, trying to find some way to open the door. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. Scratches on the wood, as if someone had tried desperately to get out of there. Deep down, I knew that fiddling with that lock could be dangerous, but I couldn't hold it. I took a tool that I had brought and started to force the lock, trying to open it. After a few minutes, I finally managed to break it and open the door. The smell that came from inside was unbearable, a mixture of mold with something that seemed more rotten. In the darkness, with the lantern I had brought, I could see several boxes and some objects covered by a dirty cloth. As I approached, I began to understand what was before me, and the horror of what I saw left me paralyzed. Inside, I saw several backpacks, clothes and shoes, all scattered on the floor or stacked in boxes. Each of these items seemed to belong to someone different, and my mind quickly put the pieces together. Other travelers like me had passed by. Beside the backpacks, I found more documents, IDs, and photos of people who until then were unknown to me, but who had somehow been stuck in this place. It confirmed my worst fears. I was not the first. I began to feel a mixture of despair and urgency. I needed to get out of there as soon as possible, before Hank and Martha realized what I had found out. When I turned to get out of the barn, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. My heart beat, and when I turned around, I saw the figure of Hank standing in the door, with a cold and calculating look that I had never seen before. He watched me in silence, as if evaluating what I would do next. Those few friendly words we exchanged in the last days now seemed a distant and distorted memory. He knew I had found out, and at that moment it was clear that he would not let me go easily. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, staring at Hank, trying to think of a way out without him stopping me. But he went into the barn, blocking the exit. The smile he used to give, kind of friendly, had disappeared, and now he looked at me with a cold, almost calculating expression. My mind was in fever, and all I could think of was how to escape from there. Not knowing what to do, I tried to disguise saying that I only heard a noise, and went to see what it was. But he did not respond, just watched me in silence, as if waiting for my next reaction. It was then that, without warning, he took a quick step towards me, and the instinct of survival took hold of me. I jumped to the side, past him, and ran as fast as I could out of the barn without looking back. I heard him yelling something, but did not stop. I ran towards the field, feeling the adrenaline take over me. The only thought I had was, get out of the property and seek help. With each step, I felt that he could be catching up to me, but luckily I managed to get to the road. With my heart racing, I kept running until I found someone who could help me. When I finally got to the road, I found a trucker who stopped when he saw my condition. I was sweating, panting, and almost unable to speak. He let me in the cabin, and while I tried to explain what had happened, he just shook his head, without understanding very well. I asked him to take me as far away from there as possible, and he, without asking questions, sped up. As the truck drove away from the farm, I could still feel Hank's cold look chasing me, even without him there. The feeling of imminent danger continued, as if I was being followed, and my heart only began to calm down when the property was already out of sight. After that, I tried to tell the authorities about what I found at the farm, but they never found anything. When they returned to the site, there was no sign of the backpacks, nor of the clothes or documents. Hank and Martha denied it, saying I was just a wanderer looking for trouble. To this day, I don't know what they did with the others or how they hid it so fast, but I know that I escaped by very little. What I found that night haunts me to this day, and every time I remember the expression on Hank's face at the barn door, I feel he is still there, waiting for the next traveler to never let go. I never believed in these things of haunted houses or supernatural events, so when Rachel and I found that old house in a quiet neighborhood, it seemed perfect. It was exactly what we were looking for, charming, spacious, and with a price that seemed like a find. At first, the move was smooth, and we were excited to decorate everything and make the house our home. But right in the first week, Rachel found something strange, a crumpled note behind our bathroom mirror. The paper was a bit worn, but the message was clear and, to be honest, somewhat bizarre. Someone had written, "If you have found this note, leave before it is too late." I laughed, thinking it was a joke from someone, maybe the old owner trying to scare the new residents, but Rachel was visibly annoyed. She commented that she found the note serious, almost as a warning, but I insisted it was nonsense. The problem is that the notes kept appearing. One day she found another in a box in the attic, then another among the loose planks of the floor. They all said similar things like, "Go away, it's not safe to stay here," and every time Rachel found another one, I saw her discomfort increase. Rachel's discomfort was getting more intense, and I could tell she was really worried about her grades. Tried to tell her that everything was just a trick of bad taste, maybe some old resident, but deep down, it was also starting to leave me with the flea in my ear. One night, while we were watching TV in the living room, we heard a noise coming from upstairs, like footsteps dragged down the floor. At first, I thought it might be something like a wood crackling sound, but the sound was continuous and seemed to be moving down the corridor. Rachel got tense and asked if we should investigate, so we went up together. Getting there, nothing seemed out of place, but I could swear the sound had come from some specific point, perhaps from our room. We went in, looked around, and everything seemed normal, but the mood was heavy. That's when Rachel noticed something new. Another note, this time left on the bed, with the familiar handwriting of the other notes. She said, "Time is running out." That was enough for Rachel to panic completely. She was convinced that someone was invading the house and leaving us these messages, so I insisted we lock all doors and windows. I spent the night awake, paying attention to any sound, but everything was calm, too quiet. The next morning, I tried to convince Rachel that we should ignore the notes and move on with our lives, but I knew she wasn't totally convinced. The tension between people began to grow. I tried to be rational, but every time we found one more of these messages, even I felt a knot in my stomach. One night, while I was sleeping, I woke up to the sound of Rachel getting out of bed. She seemed to be a bit sleepwalking, as if being guided by something that only she could hear. I called her name, but she didn't answer, just went towards the corridor and started to go down the stairs. I got up and went back, calling again, but she only looked at me for a second with an empty look and kept walking towards the basement. I was frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Rachel had never acted this way before, and the expression on her face gave me chills. She opened the basement door and began to descend without hesitation. The light was dim down there, and at each step I felt a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I kept calling her name, but she didn't answer, just went down, as if being pulled by something invisible. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I noticed that she was standing in the middle of the basement, staring at a wall. I came closer, and as soon as I put my hand on her shoulder, she seemed to wake up suddenly, as if she had come out of a trance. She looked at me, confused and scared, not understanding why I was there. It was then that we saw, just in front of her, another note stuck to the wall with a piece of adhesive tape. This time, the message was clear and frightening. She is mine now. At that moment, I felt a paralyzing cold. Rachel started shaking, and I hugged her, trying to calm her down, but I was completely terrified myself. It was as if someone or something were there with us, watching us, having fun with our fear. We decided to go up and lock the cellar door, but the feeling that something dark was stuck in us was inescapable. Each corner of the house seemed to carry a different energy, a weight, as if we were being suffocated by the structure itself. Rachel insisted that we should go out, even if it was to sleep in a hotel for one night, and I did not disagree. The idea of spending another minute there made me panic. While we packed some things quickly, we heard footsteps coming from upstairs again, just like the other night. We looked at each other, paralyzed, and then heard the sound of a door closing. At that moment, something collapsed in me. I realized that house didn't want us to leave. I knew that if we did not act quickly, we would end up stuck in that house, and it left me in complete despair. Holding Rachel's hand, we run towards the front door without even looking back. Every second there seemed like an eternity, and I felt a strange pressure on my shoulders, as if something was trying to stop us from leaving. When we finally reached the door and unlocked it, I felt a momentary relief, but as I tried to open it, the handle seemed to be stuck, as if someone was holding on from the other side. Rachel started crying, begging to get out of there, and I, in complete despair, used all the force I had to pull the door. After a few seconds that seemed hours, the door finally gave way, and we ran out, straight to the car. With each step we took away from the house, we felt the tension decrease, but the dread of that last note and the sound of the steps still echo in my mind. To this day, I can't understand what happened, but I know that something in that house never wanted us there, and we escaped by very little. When my friend suggested a last-minute visit to this art gallery that had just opened, I was excited. The idea of an old sanatorium transformed into a gallery was intriguing, somewhat eccentric, but I confess that the architecture of the place had a sinister charm. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the atmosphere already seemed dense, with those old walls and the heavy silence of the corridors. There were 4 of us, me, Carla, Michael, and Tina. Upon entering, a serious-looking lady who presented herself as the curator welcomed us. She gave us some quick instructions and invited us to explore the gallery, which is distributed in several rooms along a poorly lit corridor. At first, I found the exhibitions interesting, but something in the paintings and sculptures made me uneasy. Each piece seemed to have a presence, a touch of realism, that was too uncomfortable to be just art. In one of the rooms, Carla pointed to a sculpture that made her shiver. It was the face of a man with a frozen expression of fear, almost as if he were screaming. The most disturbing thing is that, as she watched, she noticed that the face looked familiar. When she commented that she remembered a boy who disappeared from the city a few years ago, we laughed, half unfunny, trying to disguise the growing discomfort. As we explored the other rooms, this feeling of discomfort only got worse. All the pieces seemed to have some familiar trace, as if they were people we had already seen somewhere, but we cannot remember where. Michael even made a joke that we were getting paranoid, but it was hard to ignore the impressive detail of each sculpture, especially the eyes, which seemed full of life. In one of the last rooms, we found an even more disturbing installation. a series of paintings with faces painted so realistically that it seemed they were staring at us. The eyes followed our movements, and each of us commented how we felt the weight of those looks. It was then that we decided that we had seen enough and tried to go back to the entrance. Only when we arrived at the doors, we realized that they were locked. Michael tried to turn the handle and, when he could not, called for the curator. She appeared just behind us, with a very calm expression, almost cold. With an enigmatic smile, he said that we had not yet seen the final work and insisted that we follow it. At this point, the mood was so tense that I could feel the nervousness in my friend's eyes, but without many options, we ended up following the woman down the corridor towards an area that seemed more isolated. With each step, my stomach tightened more. The corridors through which the curator guided us were darker, almost without lighting, and the silence was suffocating. I exchanged quick glances with Carla, and I could see that she was as uncomfortable as me. When we arrived at the end of the corridor, the curator opened a heavy metal door that creaked as it moved. Inside the room was the final work, covered by a dark cloth. She stood there, standing next to her, with a strange smile, as if she was waiting for something. No one knew exactly what to do or say, but Michael, perhaps trying to break the tense mood, asked if he could take off the cloth. The curator made a slow gesture with her head, encouraging him. He hesitated for a moment, but pulled the cloth, revealing the most disturbing sculpture I have ever seen in my life. It was a female figure, with a frozen expression of despair, eyes open in a way that seemed to cry out for help. At first, we were unresponsive, but when I looked closer, my throat dried up. The face had details that reminded a lot of Tina, the same eyes, the same shape of face. And the moment I realized that, I noticed that her expression had changed, as if she was screaming in silence. The shock was so great that I took a step back, bumping into Carla, who was also paralyzed looking at the sculpture. The resemblance was too scary to be a coincidence. Tina, realizing what we were seeing, began to tremble and whispered that she needed to get out of there. We tried to go back down the hall, but the curator stood between us and the door, with that disturbing smile still on her face. She told us, with a calm that made me shiver, that art requires sacrifices and that each one would have a role in that gallery. At that moment, my heart exploded, and the reality of the situation fell on us like a ton. Michael, in a desperate attempt, pushed the curator to the side, shouting for everyone to run. We took the impulse and ran back down the corridor, but each door seemed closed, as if the gallery itself was locking us in there. The sounds of our steps echoed, and I heard the quick breaths of my friends around me. The only thing in my mind was to get out of there at any cost, but with every locked door we found, despair only increased. We kept running, trying to find a way out, until finally we saw a door that seemed to be an emergency exit. Without hesitation, Michael pushed, and the door opened, leading to a narrow and dimly lit flight of stairs. We went down as fast as we could, almost stumbling on the steps. I looked back for a second and saw the curator standing at the top of the stairs, watching us with that same smile. Her expression was so cold that, for a moment, I thought she would follow us, but she just stood there, motionless, as if she already knew we wouldn't need to be chased. When we finally reached the ground floor, we found a side exit that led to the street. We didn't waste a second and ran outside, breathing in the fresh air as if we had escaped from a nightmare. We stopped a few meters from the gallery, trying to understand what had just happened. Tina was pale, Michael and Carla were in shock, and I could only think of that sculpture and how she looked alive, crying for help. The feeling that something horrible had escaped us in that building still haunts me to this day, and no art gallery has ever been the same for me. When I volunteered for this search and rescue mission, I had no idea that things could get so dark. Our job was to locate a camper who had disappeared in an area of dense forest, known for some strange cases and disappearances that no one could explain right. The team was composed of 5 experienced volunteers, including myself, and we all had some history of missions in forests and hard-to-reach regions. At first, the idea of exploring this forest seemed challenging, but nothing that wasn't part of our work. Early on, things started to get complicated. The closed forest made it harder, and our GPS devices began to fail. We thought it was only a temporary problem, so we moved on, hoping the signals would come back. But not only the GPS was still giving error, as well as our radio, and soon we lost all contact with the base. I tried to disguise the concern, but the look of others showed that they were with the same feeling. We were already deep in the forest, and a strange feeling of being watched began to form. As night fell, the forest seemed to change. Silence was almost absolute, and any small sound stood out, which only added to the tension. We set up camp in a small clearing, trying to keep us together and alert. But that night I had a very strange feeling. From where I was, you could see some shadows moving in the distance among the trees. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but I realized that I wasn't the only one who had noticed. One of the volunteers, Jim, poked me and whispered, saying he also saw something moving there. I looked around, but nobody seemed to want to talk about it, maybe trying not to let fear take over. Later, in the early morning, I heard a close noise, as if someone had moved away from the group. When I told people, I realized we were one less. It was Jim himself who had disappeared. I felt a chill in my spine, but tried to keep calm, waking up the others and saying that we should look for him nearby. We did a quick search around, calling out his name, but there was no answer, nor any sign that he had passed by. The only thing we found were their footprints, which followed straight and then simply stopped. From that moment on, the atmosphere became even more heavy. The idea that one of us had disappeared without a trace began to shake the group. Each was dealing with fear in their own way, but you could see on everyone's face that we were on the verge of panic. We tried to regroup, trying to think calmly about the next step, but it was difficult to reason with that feeling that something or someone was watching us. I began to wonder if we were really alone in that forest or had walked straight into a trap without knowing. We decided it was best to wait until dawn to look for Jim. But before the sun even started to appear, Mark also disappeared. He was with us until a few minutes before, but when I came to ask something, I realized that he was not there anymore. We went around looking, calling his name, but as before, we found nothing but a cap fallen on the ground near a tree. It was at this point that I realized that maybe we were dealing with something that understood the forest much better than us. At that point, no one else could disguise the panic. It was not just a rescue mission. It seemed as if the forest was swallowing us, one by one. Everyone began to whisper, looking around in fear that any movement in the darkness could be a threat. I tried to keep calm and suggested that we stay together, but the tension had already taken over. Janet, one of the most experienced volunteers, started to say that we should leave immediately, even without equipment and without contact with the base. I agreed with her, but the idea of moving in the dark, with those observers around, made me shiver. It was then that, during the early morning, I heard light steps approaching our camp. With my heart racing, I looked towards the sound, trying to identify if it was Jim, Mark, or maybe someone we didn't know yet. But all I saw were thin shadows between the trees, as if they were around us. When I tried to light with the lantern, the light seemed to get lost in the dense darkness without revealing anything. The tension was unbearable, and the idea that something could be approaching us every minute made me tremble. At some point, between the silence and the scattered steps, I realized that another of our people had disappeared. Now it was Janet who was no longer there. No one had seen, no one heard anything. She just disappeared. It took away the rest of the confidence we still had. Without wanting to accept what was happening, we started discussing what to do. The feeling was that, the longer we were there, but we were being cornered. We decided that at any cost, we needed to move. We couldn't wait to see who would be next. With the little we had, we took the way back in the best way we can remember, but strangely enough, the reference points that we knew seemed different. The GPS kept failing, and with each step, it seemed that the forest was wrapping us more, as if the path was closing around us. As we tried to find a way out, the environment became more and more oppressive. The trees seemed closer, and even the air was denser, as if everything were in our leading to a point of no turning. I tried to hold the lantern steady, but my hands trembled, and the silence around us was becoming heavier. At one point, the last member of the group, Sam, suddenly stopped and looked into the darkness. I asked what he had seen, but he only murmured that there was someone there, watching us. Before I could understand, he started walking towards an indistinct shadow among the trees. I yelled at him to stop, but it was like he was in a trance, ignoring anything I said. And then, out of nowhere, he disappeared into the trees, leaving only a terrifying silence behind him. Now I was completely alone. Standing there alone in that forest was one of the worst horrors I have ever experienced. I wanted to run away, but each direction seemed equally dangerous, as if everything around me watched me, married me. The sound of my own steps seemed to echo, and every little bit, I turned around thinking that I would see something lurking. But there was nothing, only shadows and the soft sound of leaves chirping, which seemed almost human, like whispers. I needed to continue, but my mind was already on the edge, and the notion of direction was practically non-existent. When I finally found what seemed to be a trail, the relief was immediate but short-lived. On the floor, there was an item from each of my companions, as if it were a trail left for me on purpose. First I saw the cap of Mark, then the broken radio of Janet. With each step, the feeling that I was falling into a trap got stronger, but I was already too exhausted to stop. Deep down I knew whatever was there, I knew those paths much better than I did. I continued following the traces left, even with fear paralyzing me to every object that I found. The forest seemed to close even more, and the silence was so dense that I could hear my own panting breath. It was then that I realized that the trail of belongings took me back to the same clearing where we had set up camp on the first night. When I arrived there, the scene was desolate. Our backpacks and lanterns were scattered, as if we had left in a hurry. In the center, there was one last item that left me completely shocked. The watch that Jim always wore, but the glass was broken and stained with something dark. That vision made me lose any hope. I no longer knew if I was being led out or into a final trap. The instinct of survival still pushed me to continue, but everything in me said that I should not be there anymore. That's when I noticed a last shadow moving in the forest, standing still, watching me. I didn't want to find out what it was. Without thinking twice, I started running, without looking back, knowing that I only had to keep going until I got out of the forest. I ran like never before, feeling every muscle of my body begging to stop, but the fear of being the next victim of that forest was greater than fatigue. Everything around me seemed distorted, as if the trees had changed position, creating a maze to trap me. I stumbled on roots, fell, raised, always with that invisible presence behind me, almost touching my neck. After what seemed like an eternity, I saw a small beam of light between the trees. It was the first sign that I was near the exit. Without hesitation, I headed toward the light until finally I left the tree line and reached a clearing near the main road. The air there looked different, as if I had come out of a nightmare. I came to look at the forest one last time, hoping to see some sign of my companions, but all I found was absolute silence and inert shadows. I escaped, but I could never understand what really happened inside, nor why I was the only one to come back. When I moved with my son Jack to that apartment, all I wanted was a place to start again. The rent was cheaper than any other option, and despite the somewhat decaying state of the building, I thought we could make it work. In the first week, I started to notice some strange things, symbols carved on the wood of the doors and walls of the corridor. I thought they were just scribbles from teenagers, but Jack began to fix his eyes on these symbols, almost as if he was trying to understand what it meant. That made me uncomfortable, but I preferred to ignore and move on, thinking it was just a phase of adaptation. As the days went by, Jack started mentioning a new friend. He said that this friend had lived there for a long time and knew many stories about the building. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, since he was trying to adapt to the new place and still had no friends in the neighborhood. But I soon realized there was something strange. Jack started telling me detailed stories about old residents, things he wouldn't know. It was when I heard him whispering to his friend at night in his room that I felt a real shiver. That night, I decided I needed to talk to him about this friend. I asked calmly who he was, but Jack's answer only made my discomfort worse. He looked at me seriously and said that his friend was called Tommy and that he lived there long before us. When I asked where Tommy lived, Jack pointed to the dark corner of the room, which made me shiver from head to toe. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that it was just a child's imagination, but deep down something didn't seem right. I began to notice that Jack changed his behavior every time he spoke about this friend. He became strange, more serious, even gloomy. After that, things only got worse. Jack started acting more reserved, and sometimes even hostile, something completely different from my sweet boy always. He began to talk about things that seemed out of the understanding of a child, details about the building, such as the fact that before it became an apartment complex, it was a home for troubled children. I had never told him that, but he knew, said Tommy showed him where bad kids were. It was then that I realized I needed to understand what was happening, and I started talking with the neighbors about the past of that place. I spoke with a lady who lived downstairs, one of the oldest residents in the building. She hesitated at first, but when I mentioned the name Tommy and Jack's strange behaviors, she looked at me as if she had seen a ghost. It was then that she told me that other children who lived in the building had started talking about imaginary friends shortly after they moved, and that these friends always knew details of the past. She said several families left the building suddenly after her children began acting aggressively, even dangerously. It froze me. She ended by saying that the building, before becoming an apartment, was a home for children, but that some of these children had mysteriously disappeared. This discovery made me panic, but I needed to know more. I went back to the apartment and started looking for signs, anything that could explain what was going on there. I could hardly sleep and always woke up with the feeling of being watched. That night, as I was trying to organize my thoughts, Jack started talking to himself in the room. I walked over there slowly and heard him whispering, almost in a tone of voice that was not his, something like, "You shouldn't be here." My heart almost stopped at hearing that. I walked into the room and asked who he was talking to, trying to keep calm, but Jack just looked at me with a strange smile and said, "Tommy thinks you won't be able to understand." That was the last straw. I no longer knew what was there. I tried to hold Jack in my arms, but he walked away and suddenly began to cry, as if back to normal, wondering what was going on with him. Seeing the fear in my son's eyes broke me. He hugged me tight, and I promised that everything would be fine, even without believing what I said. After that night, I decided I had to get out of there as soon as possible. I packed some basic things and went to a friend's house with Jack. The next day, I went back to the apartment to get the rest of our belongings. As I entered, I saw that the symbols on the walls seemed deeper, as if they had been carved again stronger. The apartment was cold, a kind of cold I had never felt before. Without looking back, I took what I needed and left, leaving that place and its stories behind. To this day, Jack never spoke of Tommy again, but I still see him looking at empty corners from time to time, as if something was still watching.